Hello, welcome to the second instalment in our family law podcast. Hopefully you've listened to the first one. If not, give it a listen. It was very interesting in my opinion. And we talked about some myths around family law and divorce specifically. As a reminder, I'm Lucy Compton. I'm a senior paralegal in the family team, and I'm joined by my colleague Peter Lowe, who is the senior partner in our team. And today, I think we're talking about some reports that have recently come out in relation to divorce. And I think they're very interesting, if I do say so myself. The first report was by Legal & General, and there's been some articles very recently about this. And it says that since 2020, 270,000 divorces have been put on hold due to the cost of living crisis and the cost of housing and concerns around income. I think a rather crazy statistic, isn't it?
I think that's right, Lucy. The report that came out early part of this start of the new year has shown that so many couples are now simply deciding that they can't afford two separate households, and they're choosing together to stay as one household. 270,000 is an enormous number that's been on hold over a relatively short period. And it's really affecting all strands of society. It's not one specific area that it's concentrated in, not one class, not one income group, because of the extra costs that are involved and because you're now running two households. It'd be really interesting to see what the long-term impact of this kind of change is going to be. From experience, I think it sees pent-up pressures within family homes. If people can't afford to separate, then it creates a much more difficult home environment. When economic times are good, people can move on, they can easily sell their home, they can easily buy a new home, they can move on with life. If you feel you're stuck in one place, that can really add to the pressure that exists within the family, and that particularly impacts on children living in that home and the high tension that can create. So I think the Legal & General report is really good, and articles to support it are excellent to understand what is actually happening on the ground. And it'd be interesting to see whether that pent-up demand, as it were, is unleashed at some point, or whether this is a true societal change, whereas previously people kept together and endured unhappy relationships because there was a stigma attached to divorce. Whether they're now going to try and endure unhappy relationships because of the financial consequences of divorce will be interesting to see. But it was a very, very timely piece of work.
I think it's even more interesting that comes at a time where the actual divorce process itself is arguably much easier than it was before. So I think that's very interesting, but perhaps a topic for another day. The second report, and I think this is about sorting out money and property on divorce. And I think you're going to go over a little bit about what that says.
Yeah, this was a much more intensive piece of work, and it's reported through Resolution, who are our family law body who promote a very conciliatory approach to family work. It came out in November time, and the findings were incredibly interesting and quite surprising. One of the key findings was only 1 in 5 couples discuss pensions when they're divorcing. As family lawyers, we're always straight on to pensions. It's one of the most important things that we can deal with, because we have, so that pensions are a really important part of that. But to find that only 1 in 5 couples actually go through that thought process, that about 30% of couples actively waived their pension rights on divorce, and only 11%, 1 in 10 divorces with a pension that had yet to be taken, had a pension order in place, pension sharing order. So they didn't go down the route of providing for themselves out of that.
I think that's crazy. With the job that we do, I think reading that was very shocking, actually. I suppose people listening to this might wonder, what does that mean?
Well, from experience, it tends to store up a whole load of trouble for the future. As I said, a good structured divorce settlement looks at different life stages. It's the one and only opportunity to get it right, and you need to look at all the components, housing and income, meeting those short-term needs, but also looking at long-term needs as well. And it seems that quite a lot of people are simply writing off pension rights at a very early stage for short-term benefit, or perhaps a focus on housing, those kind of concerns. But I think there's always a huge underestimate of the difficulty that you would have in replacing or building funds, particularly if you're not the primary earner or if you've got caring responsibilities for a family. It is incredibly difficult if you're just starting from your mid-40s or your early 50s or your late 30s to build up the kind of benefits that would be necessary to provide for yourself in retirement. So it's perfectly understandable where you're going through the pressure of a divorce settlement. You don't know what the finances are going to be the next day, in the next week, never mind the next year and in 10 or 15 years' time. But as we all know, that comes around very quickly. And divorce settlements are the real opportunity to make sure that long-term provision is properly provided for and is put away for long-term benefit.
And is it difficult to sort this stuff out?
Pensions are looked at as a separate and distinct class of assets. And most pensions these days, whether they're NHS or police or private invested scheme, make it incredibly easy for the pension to be physically shared. You don't get the money up front. There's an order which says that this percentage of the fund that's been built up during the marriage, whatever that would be, is split and it's invested for the individual who hasn't got the benefit of the pension. That money just stays there, invested until the retirement of that person who's invested for. And so the fact that only 11% of people, 1 in 10 on divorce, are sharing is shockingly low. And as I say, stirs up, I think, a whole heap of trouble or a heap of unhappiness for people in the future.
Yeah, and struggling. I think it's often the case that people will say to us, well, I'll forego that because I just want this done. I just want it done. And that's a perfectly valid thought to have. But like you say, it's planning for the future and it's thinking about how you're going to support yourself when you reach 60, 67, whatever that age is that you decide to retire. You need to make sure that you have an income. And I think that's what people don't realise necessarily. Yeah, it's quite alarming.
And this is the opportunity to get it right. We're not making any moral judgments or value judgments. It's about saying, okay, what is there available? How should that be shared fairly? And then you put it away for a long-term investment. Exactly. And, those 10, 15 years, however long, fly by. And then you know that you've got something in the bank which you can't access, but is invested for you. If you don't have that and you come back to in 10 or 15 years' time and then you try and rebuild it, that's incredibly difficult to do.
Yeah. I think something that I've seen quite a lot recently that is even more alarming to me is that less than 1/3 have an order agreed and in place that provides for a clean break or any order at all when they come to get divorced. And 2/3 don't put their agreement or settlement into an order. I think the report concluded that where matters are finalised through a court order, that's obviously then nicely tied up and nicely sorted out, but people don't have an order in place. And that is incredibly concerning. And I suppose people listening to this might think, well, what does it matter? We've agreed and there's no problem with that. They won't go back on it. What's the issue?
Yeah, I mean, we work in this kind of bubble where we assume that everybody goes through a divorce, everybody gets a financial order. We're very committed at making sure that those loose ends are tied up and whatever agreement you reach is tied up in a financial order endorsed by a court. So to find that 2/3 of people don't actually do that and that they leave that loose end in place, it is, again, a terrific piece of work by whoever conducted the research in this. And I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding, a fundamental conclusion that once a divorce is finalised, that's the end of it anyway for financial claims. And it's simply not. If a divorce is finalised but there's no final financial order, all the claims remain in place. There's a variety of different ways you can do that, but the reality is it doesn't bring the finances to an end. And there have been a number of pretty high-profile cases that have dealt with that. Dale Vance, if you want to read about that one, was way after the divorce that they had as a youngish couple with not very much money, to a point at which Mr. Vance was far more successful, and then had to deal with the consequences of a claim being made against him many years after the divorce was finalised. So it's a short-term, rather naive view of the world, because over a period of time, circumstances do change. People's income does change. They may have different requirements, and ultimately the only person that they can go back to if there's a loose end on finances is their former wife or husband. I think, it's something that does need to be addressed as clearly an unmet need in relation to that, and perhaps a better understanding of what claims are still in place.
Why do you think that people don't get an order?
Well, I think the first point is the point I mentioned, which is, I do think people, we talked about myths in our first podcast. Yeah. It's a great myth that once the divorce is finalised, the financial claims are at an end, and they're simply not. I think there's a big worry about costs. The report dealt with this as well. I think everything you see in the newspapers is that divorce costs an absolute fortune. If you go to solicitors, it'll cost you an absolute fortune, tens of thousands of pounds, and all the high-profile cases that are read about in the newspapers and the tabloids feed into this big myth as well. The report gave some guidance. It said that for couples who did incur legal costs, 24% of those couples spent less than £1,000, and 42% spent less than £3,000. So the cost is manageable. Yeah. But I'm not, playing down that is a large amount of money. Absolutely. But it is a manageable cost. Definitely. And I do think, just looping back as to the opening question on that report, what it said is that people tend to have much more positive outcomes as a consequence of taking legal advice, because it's a much more rounded, structured, designed to last over a long period of time form of settlement, rather than just a here and now settlement.
Certainly, and paying out that money, yes, like you say, it is a large amount of money, but if it can bring you some peace of mind and it can bring you certainty going forwards in your life, then it could be worth that. I suppose, what conclusions can we draw from these very interesting pieces of work that have been done?
Peace of mind. That's a really good way of phrasing it. To be fair, it is like buying an insurance policy. The conclusions are that there is a huge level of misunderstanding or unmet requirements in in the way that finance is dealt with on divorce. I think it's about understanding options in terms of the legal and general report, understanding what the impact would be on families if you choose not to divorce and remain in one household even though the relationship has come to an end. It's about accessing the right level of support for your family, and that can come from a variety of different sources, to make sure that the effect on children, their understanding of the importance of what's happening to their family comes across, and that couples are able to manage that process effectively. I think we drilled down into the details of the Bristol University report, and there are two kind of huge conclusions that come out of that. The first is, do not underestimate the importance of pensions for everybody. Most people will now be in some form of occupational pension. A lot of people are in public service pensions. They've done that over, dropped in and out of it perhaps in their careers. There will always be residual benefits. They're relatively easy to find out about, and sharing can be done fairly, providing, even if it's just a small amount of money, locked away for future need. And finally, make sure this is all tied together by finalising it with an order. It's a relatively low-cost thing to do, given the assets that are involved for most couples. And the trouble is with loose ends, you end up getting tripped up. And a number of people have fallen over these problems where circumstances change. They didn't make an order at the end of it when they could have done, and now you've got a completely new set of circumstance that require a different conclusion. And because those options remain open, a court would have to deal with it, even if it's not successful. You still are put to the time, the trouble, and the cost of having to deal with those concerns. So to that end, both pieces of work were excellent and help pop the bubble that we sometimes sit in as to the way we deal with things, because I think there is a lot of people out there who don't have that appreciation.
I think as well, if any of these matters are concerning you and there's anything that you want to discuss with us as a listener, you're more than welcome to contact us. We can be contacted on the telephone, which is 01926 886688, or by email, which I terribly forgot to mention last time, which is family@wrighthassall.co.uk. Or you can pop on our website and send us an inquiry. And